Great. Hello, everybody. Thank you for taking the time with us this morning. If you don't mind, Pat, go to the next slide there, Angela. Okay, just to show our pretty pictures, you can also see us in the Zoom chat as well. So my name is Jeff Stark. I'm an audit partner at Sensiba. We are a CPA firm. I'll get into that a little bit. I've been working with our team, what we call Risk Assurance Services Group, for many years on IT related audit information. My colleague Scott, who's the real expert on the panel today on the ISO 27001 practice, will be kind of leading a lot of the presentation. This is kind of our specialty for both of us, and we're happy to be here to help discuss this with you and to go over, potentially any questions you have at the end of the presentation. Next slide. Real briefly, Sensiba is a traditional CPA firm in that we've been, historically based out of Silicon Valley, doing audit, tax services, and consulting work. We also have a technology practice as well for implementations such as Sage, Intact, so ERP solutions. We have a sustainability practice, which is an emerging area for us. Also listed on this list of services that we provide is our risk assurance group, which I touched on briefly before. Our risk assurance services group is really focused on audit and attestation type services related to information technology primarily, but really kind of business process solutions as well. Under our risk assurance services banner, we do auditing. We handle the auditing standards. I'm a CPA. The SOC 2 standard, which many of you are probably familiar with, at least that's a presumption coming into this, is an AICPA standard. So we had handled on the side of the house. And then recently we became an accreditation body for the ISO standards as well. We have deep expertise in all kinds of different clients, but as a Silicon Valley-based firm, we work with lots of companies that are in the technology space, a lot of SaaS companies, a lot of cloud companies. And we're also very well versed in working with companies that are using the platform partners, such as Drata, Vanta, Sprinto, and the other ones that are listed on there. Or if you're doing it on your own, we're happy to do that as well. So that's kind of brief background and everything on kind of things we're going to kind of touch on. Right now, Scott's going to jump into, what is the ISO 27001. I'll go into a brief little discussion on SOC 2. Again, our presumption is there's a lot of people on this call that are pretty familiar with SOC 2, but there's always a good little refresher, and then we'll try to tie it all together at the next section where how to integrate SOC 2 and ISO 27001. With that, Scott, take it away.
Thanks, Jeff. So what is ISO? ISO essentially is the International Organization for Standardization, and it was founded in 1947. We're not going to go into a deep dive of what it is, where it came from, but you may be familiar with some of the standards out there, like 9001, which is the quality management standard. It's by far the largest ISO standard. More people are certified against that than any of the other standards. Primarily, the ones we're going to talk about today are primarily the ones at the bottom, 27001 for information security and 27701 briefly for privacy. Next slide, please. So at Sensiba, we are an ISO certification body, as Jeff mentioned, and currently we cover the standards listed here, 27001 for information security management systems, 27701 for privacy. We also do 2717 for cloud services, as well as 27018, which is for personally identifiable information. You can think of 2718 as kind of a light version of 27701. Next slide, please. So the ISO requirements differ quite a bit from the SOC 2 Type 2. The items on the left are primarily the differences. So with ISO 27001, you need to have a statement of applicability. The risk assessment is a little bit more in depth than what's required for SOC 2 Type 2. Additionally, with ISO, you have to have an internal audit and you have to have a management review of that internal audit. Something else that's a little different with ISO is very prescriptive on the number of audit days, primarily based on your organization's headcount. As you can see in the table in the middle, depending on the size of the organization, that's the starting point for the number of days. That's pulled directly out of one of the ISO standards. And so essentially, if you have 100 people in scope, it's a 12-day audit. Now, that number can go up, can also go down based on risk and complexity factors within your organization. If you're publicly traded, if you're in fintech, those numbers might be higher. If you're not, if you're, say, a SaaS provider dealing with non-PII type data and information that is less sensitive, we can actually reduce that number by up to 30%. Next slide, please. So the ISO certification is a 3-year certification standard, and it basically looks like this. So during your certification year, essentially, you're going to do a stage 1 and a stage 2. The stage 1 is essentially a readiness review. Do you have the items necessary for us to actually conduct the stage 2 audit? Most stage 1 audits at Sensiba, they last about half a day, and we're going to go through the key components. We're going to look at your internal audit. We're going to look at your management review, risk assessment, key policies and procedures. Typically, out of a stage 1, organizations will end up with what's termed areas of concern. We typically give 30 to 60 days in between the stage 1 and the stage 2 to allow you to remediate those areas of concern. Once you've done that and we get into the stage 2 is the deep dive. That's your certification audit. So essentially, we're gonna do a deep dive into all of the pieces and parts of your information security management system. Most organizations at the tail end of that stage 2 will end up with some sort of nonconformities. And nonconformities are graded into 3 different categories: opportunities for improvement, which is basically an informational, hey, you're doing something, but you could be doing it better, and this is how you could improve that. The next one up is the minor nonconformity. That minor nonconformity might be, hey, you're doing most of the things that the standard calls out, but you might be missing 1 or 2 that you need to add to a policy or procedure. And on the minor nonconformities, essentially, you have 45 days to give us a plan, what your action plan is to solve that nonconformity. A next one up is a major nonconformity, and a major nonconformity actually has to be remediated prior to us being able to issue you a certification. That might include something like you haven't conducted an internal audit. That's a must-have. So essentially, if you haven't done an internal audit and we get into your stage 2, essentially, before we can issue that cert, you're going to have to do an internal audit. ISO requires an internal audit at every step along the way. So as you can see on this chart, you'll see that orange box basically says internal audit and management review is required prior to each of your ISO audits. So you're certified, you've been through the stage 2, you've remediated any of your nonconformities. Essentially, at that point, we can issue you your cert, and 12 months after that, we're going to conduct a surveillance audit. That surveillance audit typically covers 100% of the clauses within ISO 27001 and 50% of the Annex A controls. 12 months later, we're going to do surveillance 2. That surveillance 2 covers 100% of the clauses again and the other 50% of the Annex A controls. Now, essentially 9 to 10 months after that second surveillance, we're going to conduct your recertification audit. The reason that timeline is a little bit shorter is that we need to conduct that recertification audit with enough time for the client to remediate any nonconformities that are highlighted during that recertification. So if there are any, you've got to have time to fix them prior to the expiry date. Otherwise, your certificate expires and we kind of have to start all over with the stage 1, stage 2. Once you get through that recertification audit, if you look at the line at the top, 12 months later, we're going to get into that loop that says surveillance 1, surveillance 2, recertification, loop back, surveillance 1, surveillance 2, recertification. Again, internal audits, management reviews required at each step along the way. Next slide, please. So the next question is, who needs ISO 27001? As has been mentioned previously, essentially, ISO is an international standard. So if you are supporting international customers, you have clients all over the globe, essentially you're going to want some sort of an ISO standard because that covers a broader range of markets. So the SOC audits typically are North American focused, and if you have North American clients, SOC is very important to you. But if you're going beyond North America, you definitely need an ISO. So if you have international customers, if you want to grow into international markets, or if you have sensitive information, pretty much anybody who has a website that's something more robust than just an online brochure probably could use an ISO 27001. As far as types of companies, we do a lot of work, as Jeff mentioned, being Silicon Valley based, we do a lot of SaaS providers, we do financial institution, healthcare providers, et cetera. Next slide, please. I'm going to throw it back over to Jeff for what is a SOC 2.
Yeah, thank you. Angela, can you go to the next slide? All right. Again, we have time for questions as at the end of this, at least slated. We're also going to go through any of the questions that we don't get to, so feel free to post them, and we'll go through any of the ones that we don't get to on the call due to the just the length of time that we have. But if there's anything comes up, please let us know. But I'll just try to explain a little bit about the SOC 2 standards in juxtaposition of what Scott was talking about, ISO. Most of us that have that are on this call that have involved with SOC 2, there's probably some sort of vendor management issue that's driving it. There's a security risk questionnaire or answering for an RFP. That's really what's kind of driven the SOC 2 as kind of the de facto requirement, especially in North America. And then with the reach of the cloud, we do also have a lot of international clients that do it as well. SOC 2 is also more of a process type thing as well. With ISO, it was kind of over a 3-year period. In general, when people are asking for your SOC 2 report, they're asking for your annual report that's done on an annual basis. So that's kind of the cadence that works with SOC 2. You do a full report each annual period. SOC 2 is on the trust services criteria, primarily security, but there's 4 other ones as well. Oftentimes we'll do availability because that's pretty easy to do if you're 100% in the cloud. It can get more complicated if you're not. And then confidentiality of data. Do you have a data classification system? So those are the 3 that are the most common. There's also privacy, which is done in certain instances where there's specific privacy concerns around PII data and in your processing of your privacy program. And then the last one is processing integrity, which is usually specific business case. We kind of touched on the growth. Due to this vendor risk issue, there's just been tremendous growth in SOC 2. Those of you that are working with these readiness platforms, many of those platforms have received a tremendous amount of venture backing because the market is so huge. And so there's just been a great expansion in doing the number of SOC 2 reports. And that's what we're really seeing is a lot of companies are starting with SOC 2. Then they're saying, hey, by the way, I'm also getting asked for ISO. What does ISO mean? How does that interplay with the SOC 2? So hence the reason for this presentation. The SOC 2, unlike the ISO standard, is an audit report. It is not a certification. So there's actually a specific audit opinion that we sign. Generally, they look the same. But there's reasons why that they would be different. There's even instances where we'd issue an adverse opinion where we actually don't agree with management. But in general, what you want is a clean opinion. The SOC 2 standard is an AICPA auditing standard, an attestation standard that is based on reasonableness. So we're not looking for perfection. It's not a graded score. You don't get an A or B or C. You get a clean opinion, or you get some other outcome that we'll probably want to work with your auditor and try to address and see how we could fix that. And there's not numerous ways to kind of fix that. I'll touch on this briefly, but there's a type 1 and a type 2 report. Like I touched on before, when people are asking for your SOC 2, they want a SOC 2 report for the last year, covering a year generally. In instances where you don't have a SOC 2 yet, there's different options, including shortening the type 2 period, maybe 3 months instead of a year, or maybe 6 months. Or you could do a type 1 report, which is as of a day, to kind of give your vendors and your other stakeholders some confidence that your systems is in place and that you're ready to start your type 2 cycle. SOC 2 Plus, you can integrate other standards within the SOC 2 reporting framework. Not commonly done, but it is done. So maybe you want to integrate HIPAA as a compliance regime related to HIPAA or NIST or other frameworks as well that exist out there. Yes, there's a path for doing that, and we could talk to you about that. And then I briefly touched on the SOC 2 platforms, but we have really, the industry kind of found a need here. This was a gap helping our clients get to SOC 2 readiness. Auditors are not the greatest to do that. Auditors are supposed to be independent of everything that's involved with the system, and so we can kind of provide guidance and tell you some things. But these SOC 2 platforms have really helped our clients get from 0 to really moving forward on their platform, on their program. And those platforms are all looking at the ISO standards as well to kind of help there are customers that, hey, now I need to get to ISO. How do I do that? And the platform, and we're working with those platforms, pretty much all of them, on how to get that integration to work between SOC 2 and ISO. Next slide, please. All right. I think, Scott, I'm passing this back to you for this slide.
Sure. So then the next natural question is, who needs both? So if you are a global company trying to do business in North America, but you're from Europe, let's say, you probably want to get a SOC 2, even though you already have an ISO. Or if you are a North American company who wants to do business overseas and you want to be compliant in those markets and kind of show your credentials to the rest of the world, then you would take your SOC and add an ISO to that. So essentially, any company who wants to demonstrate their security against multiple standards. Next slide, please. So the next question is, how do you align your ISO and your SOC 2? So as Jeff mentioned, we work a lot with GRC platforms, and one of the things you'll see if you are a user of a GRC platform is you might start out with SOC and you say, hey, I want to add ISO. And so you go to that platform, you ask them to set you up on SOC or on ISO. Essentially, what you're going to see is that there's about a 70% overlap where you're 100% on SOC, you add ISO, it's going to say you're about 70% complete on ISO. The deltas are kind of what's on the sides there, right? So the thing that doesn't come in as part of SOC is the statement of applicability, the internal audit requirement, and the management review. If you already have ISO and you want to add SOC, the differences are kind of on the right, where ISO doesn't really care about performance evaluations. SOC has a higher sample requirement and also has the ability to cover processing integrity. The items in the middle are common between the two frameworks, and like I said, that's roughly a 70% overlap. Next slide. So the key differences, as Jeff mentioned, ISO is a certification of the management system, where SOC 2 is not a certification, it's an attestation of a system, not the management system. So again, the key for ISO is primarily businesses doing wanting to do business outside of North America. Also, ISO is a point in time audit. We care about, when we audit against ISO, what's in place today, where SOC 2 Type 2 is a look back over the last reporting period, whether that's a year, 3 months, whatever your reporting period is. It's looking back, were you doing all those things for the entirety of that period? So in some ways, in that regard, ISO, I think, is a little bit easier to hit because it's what's happening today. As long as everything's in place today, you're good to go. In SOC, you might say, well, we didn't have multi-factor authentication a month ago, but we have it today. You could still end up having an issue there, where with ISO you wouldn't. Some say that the requirements for ISO are more strict. For example, the clauses in ISO 27001, clauses 4 through 10, those are mandatory. You have to do those things. In SOC, you can tailor that the audit parameters to meet your needs. So it's not mandatory other than the security TSC. Again, back to being internationally recognized, and SOC 2 is more tailored for the organization. Next slide. So again, to kind of drive home the concept of system versus management system, if you are a company that has multiple products that you want to get SOC reports done on, typically you need a separate SOC report for each system. So if you have 3 systems, you're going to have a separate SOC report for each one. If those 3 systems are under the same management system, essentially saying how we do business, we do the same thing with our coding, and our coding standards are the same across all 3 of those systems. Our management responsibilities, our policies and procedures, they are encompassing of the whole organization, then essentially that's the management system, and ISO can do that with a single certification. Next slide, please.
quick on that, Scott. Sorry
Yep.
to go back on, just to touch on it real briefly. The other thing with the system in the SOC world is that's company defined. So it is up to management to decide what the system is, kind of what's the boundaries of the system. That is up to your definition. You do have to agree with that on your audit. Does make sense? What's the data that's encapsulated? What's the software that you use? What is the infrastructure to use? So it doesn't necessarily mean you absolutely have to have a different system if you use like two different cloud providers per se, but it may make sense. So you'll want to work all that out with your auditor. But in general, you're going to do it at the system level. All these decisions are at the system level. For ISO, you're really going to kind of do it at the management slash then the organization level.
Thanks, Jeff. We've touched briefly on the internal audit requirement. We've actually had some clients who are potentially using a GRC platform who think that, oh, the GRC platform can audit my system. Well, they really can't. So what's required by the standard are
No.
essentially two components. One is that whoever's doing your internal audit is competent in the ISO standard. They've got experience with it. They understand it. Whether they've been through training, whether they're lead auditor certified, is a gray area, but they need to be competent with the ISO standard, need to be able to demonstrate that. They also need to be independent and impartial from the ISMS. So what most organizations run into is I've got somebody, I'm a small organization, I've got somebody who's really smart on ISO, but they're involved with setting up my ISO program or my ISMS. They can't actually conduct that internal audit.
Yeah.
And
Real
go ahead,
quick
Jeff.
on that as well. So in the SOC world, there's also a concept of relying on internal audit function. So generally, an internal audit is something that is independent of the people that are operating the operations of the system. If there is an internal audit function, which we generally only see at very relatively large companies that have other business purposes, we can rely on that as well. But in the ISO world, it's actually mandatory. You have to have this internal audit function. Where in the SOC 2 world, we can just use it if it's available.
Excellent, thanks. So what does that mean to you? So on the ISO side of things, essentially most organizations end up vending their internal audit to a third party. Again, back to the point that if they have somebody on staff who is competent in the ISO standard, they're not independent, or they don't have somebody who's competent in the ISMS. So the other piece is they want to do better. They want to be more secure. They want a more thorough evaluation of their management system. So that's one of the reasons that a lot of organizations vend to a third party that internal audit function. Next slide, please. So one of the things you can really do to help yourself as an organization streamline the process for you is, if you look at this chart, we looked at the top half of this chart earlier in the presentation. At the bottom, I've layered in there the SOC to type 2 in there. So ideally what you want to do is try to line up the end of your SOC 2 type 2 period with your ISO audits. So essentially, if you look at the first light blue square on the left there, you want to line that up with your stage 2. So if your period ends on 4/30, that's when your SOC auditors are going to start reviewing your evidence. It's also when you would want your ISO auditors to begin their stage 2. And part of the reason for that is, A, it doesn't feel like you're being audited all year long. Essentially, we can now do this once a year so that you have these audits, at one calendar time throughout the year. The other is, as I mentioned previously, SOC requires a higher sample count, a higher percentage of samples. So when we talk about onboards, offboards, change tickets, things like that, depending on your organization size, SOC is going to say, hey, I need to see 10 of each of those, where ISO might only require 5 of each of those. And so if your SOC auditor selects 10, ISO can use those same samples. So you're not having to gather samples that are different for each ISO and SOC. And so typically what we would want to do, the way this chart is laid out, so the first SOC 2 in this chart is a 3-month, and then we go to a 12-month reporting period. So essentially, you line up that surveillance with your second SOC 2 Type 2, and then your surveillance 2 would be on your third SOC 2 Type 2 period end. So that's typically how we would want to do that, and that gives us the ability to collect evidence once and audit it against many standards. Next slide, please. So the keys to aligning that ISO and SOC 2 is mapping controls, making sure that that you understand what's in there, and that you get those controls lined up, and that you have the controls met for both the Annex A and ISO 27001 and within the SOC. And then utilizing GRC tools can absolutely help you get those together, because they're very good at kind of marrying up all those different standards, and that includes items like HIPAA or GDPR or something like that. So essentially, they will tell you, hey, if I want to add GDPR to my current GRC utility, then essentially it'll say, oh, you're 50% there, and now you can go work on what the deltas there, what you need to fix for GDPR. And again, it's good to have the conversation between your SOC and your ISO auditors to set up those timing considerations and conversations. Because essentially what you can do is you can shift. If you already have SOC, you've been doing SOC for years, and your period is in January, or period ends in January, and it's now June, and you want to start your ISO work, you may want to shift the Type 2 period to line up with your ISO work. So possibly shorten that ISO period or move it. And Jeff, I don't know if you want to weigh in on moving that period at all.
Yeah. So again, SOC 2 doesn't have prescriptive things in it. So the definition of the system's up to management. The reporting period is up to management. When does it make sense? So when we're talking about readiness with our clients, like getting from 0 to our first SOC 2 report, you can shift the time of when that first report's going to happen. We usually talk to our clients with the end in mind, like what's a good typical business cadence? When would you want this SOC 2 report to be done? Does it make sense from you, either from we have capacity issues internally, this is the best time for us to deal with auditors, so maybe work that way, or we know our clients always ask us for this reports in Q2 or Q3. But really, absent that, there's no specific requirement to have the SOC reports end on any particular day. Like December 31st is not a requirement. October, you can end in the middle of the month, as long as it makes business sense for you and you agree with that period for the auditors. And really what you want is, when you're going from I don't have anything to SOC 2 and then on into the future, ultimately you want it so these controls and these processes operate. You don't want to be doing things and going, okay, I got to get this done. I got to start doing things this way because my audit's coming up. So let's go and start cleaning up procedures. If you're going to implement processes and procedures, that means we're going to commit to the management is going to commit to those going forward. The auditor is going to sign off on them and say this is a good thing to do. And you really want to do that, basically that same concept, and tie it into your ISO audit as well. So some of these efficiencies are really about operating efficiencies, about managing the audit. And as long as you're really operating your company consistent with what you're stating that you're doing under the ISO standard or under the SOC 2 standard, the audit is not really this huge event. It's more of kind of like a thing that you just get through the whole process. So we definitely advise our clients to really keep that fundamental thing in mind. If you're going to do this, let's do things right. And really, ultimately, especially SOC 2 is built on business best practices. These are not esoteric things that are very specific requirements that you got to do that you wouldn't do otherwise or don't make sense from a business perspective. So overall, they do think there, but there is more documentation required, there's more process required in there. So focus on doing things right internally. Line up your audit to be as efficient as possible as you're going through these things down the road, but really kind of focus on that efficiency. And then on the sampling thing, I don't want to overstate how much sampling is. It is a thing, because we're auditing a period of time under a SOC 2 Type 2. But samples is most often the area where we find problems. So there's a concept of a manual control that operates with manual intervention, human intervention, versus an automated control that is just automatic, it runs. So an automated control is encryption of data. it's you flick the switch, it's basically encrypted data. But the processes where, hey, we're onboarding and offboarding people, these are where the errors will happen in SOC 2 reports most often. Our sampling will uncover that very often, and that's where the exceptions will show up on our reports. So those process types areas you really want to focus on as well as making sure you have those things tight and that those things are happening.
Right.
Anything else I need to touch on there for you, Scott?
No, I think that makes sense. So to drive that point home a little bit, so make sure when you're doing things like your offboarding procedure, make sure that you are actually offboarding people who have left the company and things like that. I think that's what Jeff was getting at, where organizations end up in trouble is that, hey, Joe left, 6 months ago and his account's still active and things like that. So it's about doing the right thing all the time as best as you can and making sure that your procedures are tight, not just during that audit, scope of things. So ideally, you're doing things right. But back to those samples, the ISO auditors can use the SOC sample selections, which is great. And as far as aligning goes, that's pretty much all there is. It's not too difficult, and your auditors should be able to work with you on making sure your life is easier as you get into those audit cycles. I think that's about it. Next slide, please.
That's a
So,
questions.
yep.
So,
Yep.
so Scott, I think we have a few questions in the Q&A section that I could run by you, and some of them for both of us.
Sure.
And then if we have some time at the end, I think we go till 9:45. So if we have time at the end, what we could do is kind of show you what the ISO report looks like, and if it's helpful, a SOC 2 report as well. But let's go through these questions and see where we end up. For everybody in the chat, if you have anything else that you want to ask us, let us know. Please drop it in the chat. If we don't get to it today, we will try to follow up and give you at least our best answer on that. And then going forward, we're more than happy to communicate with anybody on this. This is what Scott and I do, is us work all the time. We talk to clients about this, and we talk to clients in all phases of readiness. So you don't have to be perfectly, ready to go to talk to your auditors. It's probably a good idea to figure this out. And, and if you need some planning help, let us know. All right. So from the chat, we have a couple questions. So on the internal audit, this one just came in. Can the same auditor run the internal audit for ISO and for SOC? And so, Scott?
So first of all, SOC doesn't require an internal audit, but if somebody had that as a SOC control, technically, yes, it could be the same person doing that. Again, the keys for ISO, where it is a requirement, is that the person is competent and independent. So yeah, that could happen where it could be the same person.
Yeah, it definitely can be the same person. In general, what I would say in SOC, to reiterate, very rarely do we see this done. There's a pretty prescriptive set of rules that we as auditors would have to say, we're going to rely on internal audit. And really the benefit would be there's so much testing that has to happen, i.e. it's a large company, probably thousands of employees or multiple organizations spread across different locations where it would make sense to do this. And there's an existing audit function. So we'll never prescribe or tell you to get us internal audit function. But if it is in place, that's great. And a lot of times what we call an internal audit function is somebody that's from the outside on a consulting basis that's helping you get yourself organized and ready. So that'll be beneficial as well, no matter what, for the SOC 2 process. All right. Another question on here. I've heard it suggested a SOC 2 audit could have a few elements added to it, and it also be used as an internal audit outsource. Have you experienced with that? So I think it's for me. So definitely SOC 2, you can add things to it, but primarily the SOC 2 standard is based on the trust services criteria. There's a concept of a SOC 2 plus, and you can integrate other frameworks is kind of the best description of it. But HIPAA is one that we see a lot. They're like, hey, I got a company, they've outsourced medical data to me or health information to me. They're worried about my HIPAA program. So we could talk to you about that, or you could do a standalone attestation work for your HIPAA environment. But the SOC 2 Plus could incorporate the HIPAA requirements as well, or NIST, or various other ones. On the using the internal, or can it be used as an internal audit outsource? So yes, The instances where we generally see SOC 2 is kind of integrated into internal audit. If you have an internal audit function at your company, your organization is large enough, a lot of times they will be the ones either helping administer the SOC 2 program, or they'll be taking the SOC 2 as part of their overall assessment of their risk at the companies when they're doing their internal audit. So it can be used for that as well.
Hey, Jeff, I think Alan clarified that a little bit, and he was wondering if it could be used as an internal audit for ISO. I've not seen that done, Alan. A couple of things that are key there is that what the standard calls out is that the internal audit needs to be against the 27001 standard. And so as long as it's that the SOC auditor understands the ISO standard and is auditing all of those clauses and controls, then yes, in theory it could be. I've never seen it done though.
Yeah.
But theoretically, I think the answer is yes.
Yeah. And I think one of the other efficiencies there would be probably you'd want, but probably the best efficiency is if your ISO auditor is your SOC auditor, which would automatically preclude the SOC auditor from being the internal audit function anyway. So, so from an efficiency standpoint of what we generally see, I think Scott answered it right there. Okay, Scott, I think we have one other question. My understanding is that GDPR is one of the more stringent privacy requirements. If we are GDPR certified, is there a reason we would look into ISO for privacy or even test for privacy criteria in SOC 2? I'll give that to you, Scott, first, and I could talk to the SOC 2 side.
Yeah, my understanding is that there is not actually a GDPR certification. You may have had some sort of an audit done against the GDPR standard, where if it's a SOC AUP or an add-on to SOC, potentially. It really depends on your client's needs and what your clients are looking for. If they say that's good enough for them, that's great. But as far as my perspective on it is that compared to a GDPR attestation, for lack of a better term, essentially, I think the ISO 27701 is a deeper dive. It's more thorough on what is required, and it does line up really well with the GDPR. Back to you, Jeff.
Yeah, our counsel generally is when we're talking to clients about whether we add PII, or excuse me, the privacy criteria to the SOC 2, is it really going to be beneficial? So GDPR is a law, and no certification or audit is going to get you out of the requirements of the law. So definitely you're going to want to have legal counsel involved, try to really understand what your overall risks are. There are real penalties for violations of GDPR. But then the other thing too is, are you really processing privacy information, or are you really more of a custodian? If you're more of a custodian, then your risks really are not that great related to, you're not buying and selling personally identifiable information. You're not really processing, you don't have all these elements that would really kind of drag you into the higher risk areas of GDPR. So oftentimes our clients that think about adding privacy to their SOC 2 kind of back off on it unless there's really a privacy program in place, and then the risk really makes sense for them to jump on that. All right, cool. So with that, I think we're going to run to a few more questions, Scott. So,
Yep.
All right, so can we mark some controls policy as not relevant, which are flagged by our Vanta tool? For example, whistleblower policy, but is not applicable to us. So if you want to touch, can you touch on that on SOC, on the ISO side, and I can touch on SOC 2?
Yeah. So the way that works in ISO is none of the Annex A controls within ISO 27001 are required. Technically, you're getting certified against the clauses. So the way you would exclude that in the ISO world is in your statement of applicability, you can say this doesn't apply to us. We have a lot of clients who are virtualized, right? They don't have bricks and mortar. So they essentially scope out things like physical security because they don't have an office. Whistleblower policies and things like that are not part of the ISO standard. Jeff, I don't know if they're
Yeah, it's SOC
anywhere in
2 as
SOC.
well. They're not part of the standards. And then overall, for everybody that's working with these platforms, what we want to do is find your auditor, communicate with them, and go, hey, what do I need to really do in Vanta or Drata or SecureFrame because you're basically going from a big list and you want to make sure that you align those controls to what really matters for your environment. And that's based upon your risk assessment, the auditor's risk assessment. So you're not going to do everything that's in Vanta. So definitely whistleblower would be an optional item. All right. What else do we got here? I think the next question is real quick. How would SOX fit into all this? Well, SOX world is a little bit of a world that is kind of outside of this area, but it's analogous. Generally, SOX is the internal controls for public companies related to financial reporting. That's more analogous to what's called a SOC 1 report, which is not a subject for this topic. But some of the controls that are in the SOX world, like especially what we call IT general controls, are aligned with what's requirements in SOC 2, and hence kind of will map to the ISO standard as well. And then I think we have one other question here, Scott. So what is the ROI, or how can business use this to increase sales, market themselves, and get more profit? What also the percentage of time that need to be invested, and whether it's worth it for companies in the Asia Pacific region? So I'm going to have you touch on that first for ISO, and then I can talk to how we'd answer that for the SOC 2 world.
Yeah, so in the ISO space, essentially it makes more sense to be talking about that in the APAC region than potentially SOC. However, most organizations, it's a difficult number to quantify, right? So a lot of organizations use these certifications as marketing material, right? So, hey, we're secure, we're more secure than our competitors. And so we can prove that by showing this ISO certification or this SOC report. And so it's hard to say, what does that translate into number of sales, number of dollars, things like that. So it's a difficult one to quantify. It really depends on you and your market and how you need to compete with those that you're competing against. And if that's a differentiator for your organization, by all means, it's probably worth it. And so I would say it's good to take a look at those and figure that out. Jeff?
Yeah, and North America, SOC 2 has become almost a requirement. Not 100%, but it's pretty rigid requirement based on vendor risk management for companies in North America saying, hey, I'm going to give you this risk questionnaire of all the things that you need to do if I'm going to outsource any data to you. No, usually one or two on that list is a SOC 2 report. So it has driven the growth extensively. And we're seeing that kind of becoming a de facto for anybody that's especially on the cloud. Yeah, so I think we're kind of getting close to time. Angela, did you want us to wrap up, or?
It looks like we had one more question come in.
Oh yeah, let me take a look at that. How would your approach be if clients from North America require ISO 27001? For example, if we already have a SOC 2 Type 2 compliance and both of us only operate in North America. Yeah, so this would probably be a business decision. I think if you already have SOC 2 and your customers or prospective customers are asking for the ISO standard, you may come to a business decision where we got to go after this client or this region or this market. It is definitely going to be a requirement for us to get there. Or you could say, look, I have SOC 2. We think this is analogous to it, and can have that dialogue with your people, with your prospective customer. Scott, I don't know if you had anything else to add on that.
Yeah, I would say that if it's really about if there's a demand for it, if you're trying to do business outside of North America, you're trying to push into Europe or APAC or somewhere like that, where it would make sense to add ISO, the approach would be we would work. If we were doing both your SOC and your ISO, we would work together. We're all in the same team here in our risk assurance department. And so essentially what we would do is we would take the controls that you have in place. We would say, okay, in order to get ISO, there's that 30% delta, right? So even if you're not on a GRC platform, we can still help you get to that ISO 27001 certification based on what you're already doing for your SOC 2 Type 2. So it'd be helping you get to those things like your statement of applicability, your internal audit, your management review, and doing those sorts of things to add that ISO 27001 certification to your standards.
Yep. All right. Cool. I think we're at time there, Angela.
Yes, we are. Yep. And all questions answered.
Ha, that's amazing. That tied in. All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Again, we're happy to chat with you. We have a whole team of experts that can help as well. So let us know if we can help you on SOC 2, ISO, or doing both.
Thanks, everybody.